Hello, you gorgeous lot. Welcome to a brand new mini-series from the lovely people at History Hat. I'm Charlotte White, but you can call me Charlie, and this is MsUnderstood. I'll be joined by a stellar lineup of guests who will each help me explore the lives of women who've been dealt a bit of an unfair hand by history. They may not all be great women who changed the world. They may not all be good women, but they will all be interesting. Some have been forgotten, some ignored, some misrepresented. They've all been misunderstood. My first guest is someone I'm really excited to get back on the podcast. Eilish Gregory is a doctor of early modern British history and postdoctoral Little Company of Mary Fellow in the Centre for Catholic Studies, Department of Theology and Religion at Durham University. Now, that is a fascinating job title, and I think will have to be the subject of a future episode. She's held research fellowships at the Folger Shakespeare Library, Durham University, and Marsh's Library. She's published works on the plight of the Catholics during the English Revolution and Queen Catherine of Braganza's place in the court of King Charles II. She's here today to kick off our series in style and to talk to me about this most misunderstood consort and the scandal that could have cost her her crown. Hello, Eilish.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me back.
It's Charlotte, but it's fine. It's an easy mistake
Yeah,
to make.
yeah. Well, Alex and Charlotte. So,
Alex and Charlotte.
sorry.
It's okay, don't worry.
You can
I
tell I've not had enough coffee today.
it's I think we're all feeling a little bit like that. The sun started coming out and we're all just, all off our game a bit. But we're going to be talking about someone completely perfect today, as someone who has spent a lot of time with King Charles II. Reading about his wife is sort of almost a peripheral activity when she's so central to everything. So let's begin by introducing Catherine to the listeners. We perhaps think of her as Charles II's hard done by, cheated on, and barren wife. Can you reintroduce her? Imagine we've got none of these preconceptions. Who is Catherine?
Well, thank you, Charlotte. So, with Catherine of Braganza, she is a Portuguese princess. So she is the Portuguese Infanta. That's the title she's given as the princess, like the princess of Portugal, from the House of Braganza, based mainly in Lisbon, in Portugal. And the Braganzas had only been in charge of Portugal for about 20 years before Catherine came to England to marry Charles II. So it was a whole new dynasty that ruled Portugal at the time. And so lots of uneasiness and instability at the time. But then England had also had that issue as well. So
Oh, just a little bit.
yeah, just a tad. And so Catherine Braganza had been brought up in a very loving household with her brothers and sisters, and she had a very sheltered life, and that's something a lot of people have focused on. That she has been she was very sheltered, brought up as a very devout Catholic. Like Catholicism was a central part of her life, but she was also known to be very kind, very generous, and just very, sort of trying to have a positive outlook on the world as she saw it. And so when she came over to England, she did not really know what to expect other than she was there to go to England, marry the king, hopefully have some children, and to represent everything that was important about Portugal to her new subjects.
Gosh, and the reception she received is famously not very kind from Charles's courtiers.
No, definitely not from the courtiers. I mean, when she left Portugal, they had like lots of celebrations and parties. And, when she came to England and had public displays, they had like something on the Thames, water spectacles and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think when Catherine came to England, the courtiers were a bit mean to her. And even Charles is rumoured to have said, oh, her hairstyle, if anyone has seen the famous portrait of Catherine before she came to England, he said that her hairstyle made her look like a bat, which is,
Mm.
but we don't know if he did say that or not, but that's what is rumoured that he said. And yeah, so people said, oh, because she dressed old fashionedly to the eyes of the English court, who had the up to date French style, because obviously Charles II had been living in exile for the whole of the 1650s, so he had adopted the French style, and that's obviously whatever the king wears, that's what the court's going to go by.
Uh-huh.
And so Catherine was wearing the fashion of Portugal, but it was slightly, compared to other parts of Europe, a bit behind the times. So they still had those big giant, what I think they called farthingales, those
Yeah.
big hooped dresses, and her hair being done like the sort of triangle look that portrait has. And also she had a bit of an olive skin complexion, so she was a bit darker compared to other courtiers who obviously would have had probably very pale skin, which I would have definitely been fine walking up in the court. But it was a bit unkind because she may have not been the beauty of many of Charles's mistresses. People did say she wasn't ugly. Apparently she had very beautiful eyes and that she had a genuinely lovely smile, and there was a pleasant outlook of her. And she actually adopted the style of the court very quickly. Like, she pretty much ditched the farthingales and started dressing in the French clothes and the clothes that Charles had bought her as wedding gifts. So when she got off the boat, yeah, but after that, I think the courtiers were probably just being a bit mean to her after that, in that regard.
Amazing. I mean, it's so tempting to go cradle to grave with Catherine because I don't know about you, I just feel that there's woefully little about her. There's so few books. There's so little spoken about her. She's almost also ran in the story of Nell Gwyn and et al. That Charles spent time with. But we're really going to drill down on a piece that you wrote about Catherine during the Popish plot and the exclusion crisis, because I think this is a brilliant way for us to start understanding the woman behind this myth. So how did this gathering storm begin, and where did Catherine fit into the mix?
Yeah, it's a very long and complicated story about how this happened.
Get
Um,
comfy.
yeah, exactly. So the Popish plot, it happened in 1678, so the autumn of 1678. So it really started kicking off from about October and just kept escalating after that and leading to the exclusion crisis, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about much more later. So what had happened was, beforehand, in the summer of 1678, these individuals called Titius Oates, William Bedloe, and Israel Tongue had gone to tell members of Charles's court, and even to try and tell Charles himself, that there was an assassination plot to try and kill him by Catholics. And that apparently a couple of priests walking around trying to shoot the king in the park, because the king famously always walked in the park, obviously with a couple of attendants, but he quite freely was happy for people to come up to talk to him. And so, this is what happened was when they said, oh, someone's trying to kill you, and he's just like, oh really? Okay, whatever. So carried on walking. But obviously people thought that maybe something needs to be looked into this, because the whole idea that there might be Catholics lurking around, who don't like the king, to try and bump him off. And so Titius Oates, William Bedloe, and Israel Tongue had gone to swear some depositions before a local justice of the peace in London called Sir Edmund Berry Godfrey. And shortly after that, Godfrey disappeared, and he was found dead in a ditch with his sword run through him in Primrose Hill in London. And so when it came to realise that Oates, Bedloe, and Tongue had sworn these depositions before Godfrey and hadn't been investigated, suddenly people thought, oh, maybe Godfrey had been killed because he knew too much, and there is actually a Catholic plot to kill the king. And so it sort of escalated from there. And the reason why Catherine of Braganza was brought into the mix of these whole rumours about and hysteria about the Popish plot is because her household was linked to the alleged plot, that, and as a site of where Godfrey was apparently murdered. Because in Primrose Hill, when they found his body, bear in mind this is 17th century forensics, they saw there was no blood around him. So clearly they knew he had been moved, his body had been moved potentially. And so rumours started that, oh, he must have been killed at Somerset House, because he lived quite close to Somerset House. He lived somewhere not far from the Strand, which is where Somerset House is. And that's how Catherine got implicated, because suddenly her household was accused, and therefore she was apparently complicit to try and kill her own husband off.
It, it's incredible for anyone who's not experienced the madness that is the Popish plot. I think the best way we can possibly describe it is it's the QAnon of its day, because
Yeah,
the madder it sounds, the more someone will say, ah, but, and Godfrey, his death becomes this kind of klaxon for, well, there's clearly something here. The Catholics are up to something, because otherwise Godfrey wouldn't be dead.
exactly. And I mean, there's this really good book that's recently come out in the last year or so by Andrea Mackenzie, where she looks into the whole build up to Godfrey's death and disappearance, and whether had he tried to kill himself, or did certain people try and kill him? Did Charles's brother try to kill him? Was Somerset House involved? So it's quite interesting just to look at that and how in the 17th century people tried to investigate how he died. But yeah, it was just escalated so much, and Godfrey became almost like this sort of martyr to the cause, if you can call it that. Bear in mind, he wasn't Catholic, like this figure of someone who had been martyred in the defense of Protestantism and in defense of liberties and everything like that in the period. And, you know, they had playing cards famously depicting the apparent stages of how he had gone to Somerset House, was bumped off by Jesuits, and was laid out in the chapel in Somerset House before he was taken in a little carriage and dumped in Primrose Hill.
Oh my goodness. And this is shocking stuff. This is implicating the Queen's household in this. So, you know, King and Queen, they don't really live together in this time, do they? They've both got their own thing going.
Yeah, and and I think a lot of people, when they have looked at Catherine of Braganza in the past, have commented, "Oh, she lives separately from the king," but all royals did that back in the period. So even go back as far as the medieval period, the king and queen always had separate households, had separate courts, and normally lived separately. And obviously would come together for certain things and, you know, share accommodation, things like that. But so it wasn't that unusual. And Charles actually spent a lot of time with Catherine at Somerset House in the evenings, like having social gatherings in her sort of like her own like special parlor area, like the sort of the withdrawing room and that sort of things like that. But they just didn't physically share the same bed. But then again, kings and queens generally didn't do that back then. They always lived separately in that regard. So yeah, so that you know,
It's a big deal for her to be implicated. I mean, Charles going to Somerset House, this actually is a great time to talk about what was at Somerset House for him. So aside from the obvious, there are ladies of the bedchamber, and he's famous for spending time with those in his own. Catherine's got quite a lot of she's got a lot of artists around, hasn't she? She's a cultural kind of butterfly in a way, isn't she?
yeah. And in recent years, people have started to look more seriously into her cultural patronage for this period. So people like Adam Morton, um, and Edward Corp, for example, have looked at the fact that she was a great patron of artists. And there's this beautiful painting of her depicted as her namesake, St. Catherine of Alexandria, which I think is in Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland now. And it depicts her as her saint with the Catherine wheel, with a cross. And it was and it was actually a painting that was replicated by other courtiers because they really liked the iconography. And even Barbara Villiers, Charles's then favorite mistress, copied the image because, you know, why rub salt in a wound a bit more by by having the same portrait done but with her face in it. um and she's also quite famously looked, you know, she has sponsored and patronized musicians, Italian musicians and Portuguese musicians in her chapel. And this is again something that I think Peter Leach has done quite a lot of research on. And we have to, I mean, so the sad thing is that Somerset House, because I went on a tour there last summer, there's hardly anything left of the original 17th century building anymore, which is really sad, apart from a few tombstones and the original arch, you know, underground walkway.
Okay.
But the chapel could seat about 300 people. It was a massive chapel,
Wow.
and it had beautiful paintings and lots of the artists of the day that had been done by Henrietta Maria and also herself, decorating and adding to the chapel. And it was somewhere that a lot of Catholics went to in that period, even though they weren't supposed to, obviously, because it was illegal to practice work Catholicism at the time unless you were the Queen or an ambassador. And so it was a great site. So it was seen as a sort of like the cultural hub
Yeah.
of art and music, but also Somerset House had a lot of illegal printing licensing going on. So a lot of illegal printing of religious books and Catholic books on her grounds. So there's a lot more Somerset House than people have given it credit for, really. That that was operating under her watch.
Yeah.
Even if she was sort of not trying to give too much attention to the fact that she probably would have known that these activities were going on.
That's amazing. I mean, to think that this is all going on, none of this is happening without her knowledge. So essentially, she's engaging in sort of illegal religious practices. Almost would the printing count as being sort of sedition and libelous and printing things that are illegal? Is that is it dodgy?
It was definitely not legal. I mean, this is something that a friend of mine, Chelsea Rutke, has done a lot of research on, and she's published on this as well. Is that Catherine, by her articles of marriage, was allowed to have Catholic books for worship in her chapel, so they could be specially imported for her from
Okay.
Europe, but people were printing books on the grounds still, which wasn't quite legal, but obviously, and throughout the 1660s and 1670s, there were people regularly presented for illegally printing on the grounds and do odd raid every now and then to check to see if there's any of these illegal books hanging around. And they normally did find books. So clearly people were selling these books on it. So there was a market for it as such. So
Wow.
it's really, really amazing. And yeah, so it's just amazing what got up, was happening on, in the context, in the lead up to the Popish plot, all these Catholic activities in her main residence of Somerset House.
Wow. So she's really facilitating anybody who's, Catholic curious to read and to visit her chapel. I understand from your article that there's a lot of women that convert in her household and around her.
Yeah, I mean, Barbara Villiers very famously converted to Catholicism, and a lot of Charles II's mistresses were Catholic as well. I mean, Nell Gwyn very famously wasn't Catholic because there's that phrase, that phrase when people were attacking her carriage, thinking it was the Duchess of Portsmouth's carriage, and she said, I am not the Catholic whore, I am the Protestant whore, to make the point that, wrong carriage. But incidentally, Catherine and Nell Gwyn actually got on quite well. Well, I say quite well together. In terms of mistresses, they got on quite well together.
Gosh, wow. I can't imagine them being together though. I mean, they see each other at the theatre, or because Nell wasn't at court so much, was she?
Well,
Being
she
so low born.
well she wasn't it, but she had her own. Charles gave her a house because of her being low born. But what was really interesting is obviously Charles always made any mistress of his like a lady in waiting to the Queen because again,
Yeah.
um,
Fair.
Nell Gwyn was made a lady in waiting, but she took the wage but didn't serve Catherine. And apparently Catherine liked that she didn't want to, because Nell didn't want to upset the Queen by being present physically in front of her. So I think she loved the fact that Nell Gwyn took the money but didn't want to offend the Queen. So, and she actually gave a pension to Nell Gwyn and Charles's son after Nell Gwyn had died and after Charles had died. So clearly she had fondness for them.
It's incredible. I mean, this all starts chipping away at that kind of image of her as being this, scorned, um, hard done by woman, that actually she was quite magnanimous to the other women who shared her husband's bed.
Yeah.
Um, Perhaps
Yeah,
with the
so
exception of Barbara.
yeah, yeah. Barbara was a special case in that regard. But yeah, but so goes back to your question. Yeah, there was lots of conversions taking place um, in at the time, not only in her court, but also in the other courts as well. And obviously, her brother-in-law, James, Duke of York, very famously converted to Catholicism, which obviously really upset the balance, which obviously played into the Popish plot quite well, really, because it obviously leads to the exclusion crisis with what do we do with a Catholic heir?
That's it's incredible. So talking about Catholic heirs, um, you compared Catherine with her mother-in-law, Queen Henrietta Maria. Both of them are Catholic princesses who marry Protestant kings under the sort of understanding that you will not have Catholic heirs. This is not going to happen. You don't get to talk to them about religion. Um, how similar are their stories?
Yeah, I mean that's a really, really good question because they were very different characters. I mean, Henrietta Maria was very famously, I'm going to try and make spread Catholicism around as such, and she wasn't shy of pushing what she wanted, which I think why she was sort of seen in a way almost like an antichrist. Not, I wouldn't I mean I don't as an antichrist as such because she was really pushing it. I mean, when she came over to England, she was I mean, think what she was 15 when she came over to marry Charles the First in 1625, and same year that Charles became king. And she had as part of her articles of marriage, she was allowed to worship openly, publicly in a Catholic chapel and have a certain amount of religious orders with her, and including Capuchins among others. And in a way, in what was similar with that with Henrietta Maria and Catherine was that they both had articles of marriage guaranteeing their religious rights, and they were allowed to have religious orders in their household. In terms of other similarities and comparisons, um, because Catherine was allowed to have a chapel wherever she worshipped. That was guaranteed in her articles. But what was slightly different with Henrietta Maria and Catherine was that, and this comes, which I talk about in the article, is the fact that when Catherine and Charles's marriage was signed off as such in the articles in the Anglo-Portuguese treaty, which was also a trade treaty with marriage sort of stuck in between all the sections, because might as well do two things at once. They in Parliament during the Popish exclusion crisis, they pointed out the fact that Charles's marriage to Catherine had been sanctioned by Parliament, whereas Charles has sort of pushed through just marrying Henrietta Maria, despite the fact that England was at war with France and kept being on and off at war with France. And so people in favour of Catherine said, oh, well, we liked her. So this makes her different from her mother-in-law because we agreed to the marriage, we agreed to having her here. We wanted her here. We probably did not want Henrietta Maria so much, but then she wasn't Spanish. So different ties. But I think they both had to face similar hostilities, obviously being a Catholic minority in a Protestant majority country. They faced similar issues, anti-Catholicism. They were sort of seen as they were both the premier figures of Catholicism in the land who could legally worship in the country, even though their subjects technically couldn't. And, they both didn't have English really when they came over. So they both had to learn English. They both had to learn and adopt English customs. And I think Henrietta Maria and Catherine did get on relatively well because Henrietta Maria purposely came over to England shortly after Catherine and Charles got married so she could help settle Catherine in and also to sort of help her with setting up her own, audiences in the evenings before Catherine decided to set up her own. Even though Henrietta Maria at the time was a bit more popular, but as soon as Henrietta Maria went back to France permanently in 1665, Catherine took over everything. And so I think they got on relatively well. I think they probably understood the similar situation that they both came in, but in different time periods as such and under different circumstances. But that's probably as far as the similarities lay because Henrietta Maria was definitely very pushy. Catherine of Braganza I think was a bit more pragmatic. She was probably a bit more understanding that you can't really push a Catholic agenda because you're going to really annoy people.
apparently Henrietta Maria's portraits were very sympathetic. She had one heck of an overbite, but yeah, she was very pretty.
Yeah, I have read that. I
Have
mean,
you read that one as well?
yeah,
It's
poor thing, poor
I
thing.
know, isn't it? I mean, she can't even answer for herself. It's just rude. But I guess one of the big differences between them is the had there not been a revolution, had there not been a civil war, Henrietta Maria would have been quite secure in her position, having, popped out several heirs and spares and daughters for good marriages for the king. Um, whereas Catherine doesn't. She doesn't have any children, and there's kind of no sign of anything coming down the line. So coming back to the Popish plot, we've got this huge scandal. The Queen and her household are implicated. Um, she's not doing kind of the one job that she's got, which is to make heirs. How easy would it have been at this time for Charles to use this as an excuse to send Catherine away and remarry?
Yeah, this is something that people really did try and push on him as well, because obviously by this point, in 1678, Catherine was just about to hit 40s because her birthday is 25th of November, which is St. Catherine's Saint Day, which is why she was named after her and why she wanted to be depicted as her. And so obviously in the modern age, you can have children at 40 and after that. But obviously back then with different life expectancies, 40, is pretty much not going to happen. And she had been pregnant a few times in 1660s, but very intermittently, and she never carried full term. And so I think even as early as 1663, so 1 year after marriage, people were trying to push Charles to get rid of her because, like, oh, she hasn't, you've been married for a year, she's not pregnant, and clearly there's something wrong with her.
Mm.
And it's really interesting because Charles understood the importance that he needed to have an legitimate heir, and he clearly had no issue with producing children, and that's
Yeah,
quite famously. But he didn't blame Catherine at all, which is actually quite kind of him, really, considering the time period as well.
yeah,
Because he said it's not her fault that she can't have children, because obviously they had both been trying, and he and saw the absolute upset she had that she couldn't physically carry a child to full term.
yeah.
But he didn't want to see it as an excuse to get rid of her as such. I mean, there was this famous plot by the second Duke of Buckingham to try and, and he approached this to Charles, funny enough, said, we can always pretend that the Queen has abandoned you by us kidnapping her and sending her on a ship to America to a plantation, then you can remarry. And obviously Charles, that did not go down well with Charles. He actually briefly banished Buckingham for such a plot. Um, but there were other people saying, oh, in the Bible it's and I think I do mention this in the article that in the Bible it does say, if you have a barren wife, you can legally divorce her and marry someone else because clearly she has failed in what she was meant to do. Again, not not putting all the blame on women on this. And
Yeah.
again, Charles was like, no. And in the Pope during the Pope exclusion crisis, people really tried to push this on him by saying, just get rid of her, marry a Protestant, and then you can get and then hopefully get a child with new wife that could be a Protestant heir, and then therefore we don't have to worry about James, and he'll go further down the line, and end of as such. But yeah, Charles was not having it at all. He would not divorce Catherine at all. He, even anyone mentioning it would, made him cross about it.
How valuable was the alliance with Portugal really? Is that sort of a something that you bring up in the article, talking about actually, we had a really good alliance. Breaking up that marriage breaks up that alliance. So how important is it?
Well, yeah, and this is the thing. This is one potential reason where some people say, oh, maybe cynically, Charles might have wanted to keep Catherine. I mean, I think he didn't love her in the way that, we would identify with love today, but he clearly had affection for her, like genuine affection for her. But one of the arguments that I talk about in the article is the fact that the Anglo-Portuguese alliance mattered a lot to Britain for stability, for the fact that they can go trade around the world, because Portugal had become a big, mighty power like Spain in overseas exploration and settling in different parts of the world. And so when Charles and Catherine married, as part of the marriage dowry, England gained Tangier in Morocco and Bombay in India. And so these were seen as great trading opportunities to all the different parts of the East and also of Africa with spices and other luxurious goods. But also Portugal had links to South America as well. So they had trade links in parts of the Caribbean, but also famously in Brazil. And so if you're going to obviously try and divorce a Portuguese princess, not only going to get rid of the queen, you're also going to get rid of an important trade link. And also means there's going to be a country who are going to be really cross with you and might make England's trading an absolute nightmare. And you can tell, I mean, I talk about this in the article, that Portugal was actually really putting the pressure on England in 1678-79, because England and Portugal had problems for years because Portugal hadn't paid all the dowry and were causing problems for people trading in Portugal from England. And they were putting restrictions like on wool and on fishing and other things. So clearly that was almost like their passive aggressive, you mess with our princess, we're going to bleed you dry, trade wise.
Oh my God, I love passive aggressive trade. Always makes me laugh. But didn't they, when Catherine first came over, and it's a big dowry that's been arranged, didn't they try and pay it off in spice at one point?
Yeah. So when she came over, they thought they were going to get it in monetary value.
Yeah.
Give
us the money.
And you know how we talk about exchange rates, like say sterling with dollars and that sort of thing. Yeah, they had an issue that England thought it was going to be a lot more than it was, because the Portuguese did it in cruzados. So there was also, we got the finances wrong, we got the exchange rate wrong. But yeah, so Portugal tried to pay the dowry through arrears in physical goods and through like spices and sugar and that sort of thing. And obviously the English were like, we wanted money.
Yeah.
So, we're in debt, but Portugal was also in debt, but they thought the trade would actually be a better solution. But the English didn't quite see it that way.
Wow. It's funny because that almost leads us in a sort of roundabout way that makes perfect sense, I promise, to the sort of second part of the Popish plot, which is after the Popish plot, you've got the exclusion crisis. So the person who brokers the deal with Portugal, which ends up with a queen who can't produce an heir, a dowry that's been paid in a big vat of spice that we don't want and no money, and trading points that at the moment are just Tangier is a money pit. It's just eating money and resources. The person who brokers this deal is the Earl of Clarendon, whose daughter is married in a sort of secret scandal to James, Duke of York, who is a Catholic. And there's an argument floating around, isn't there, that it's all been done so that the Earl of Clarendon's heirs will come to the throne. Are they Catholic like their dad?
No, they definitely were not Catholic. And that's what's really interesting. So as you say, Clarendon's daughter Anne Hyde married James because she was his mistress, and then she got pregnant, and James actually did the honourable thing and married her, but this didn't go down very well because she was not exactly a royal at all. And Clarendon was the one who, as you say, quite rightly, brokered the deal for Charles and Catherine to marry and had really pushed this Anglo-Portuguese alliance. And Clarendon was accused in 1663 that he had done this deliberately, because again, this is when there was already questions about Catherine's fertility, by saying, it's because he wants his heirs on the throne. And so by 1678, Anne Hyde had died, and James had remarried a Italian princess called Mary of Modena, who was a young teenager when she came over, and James was much, much older. So there was a worry that he was going to be Catholic heirs, but his oldest two surviving children with Anne Hyde were two girls, Mary and Anne, both very devout Protestants, because as soon as they were born, Charles had them at his court so they could be educated in to the Anglican faith, and so therefore there was no chance at all they were going to be raised as Catholics. And Mary and Anne were very devout members of the Church of England, so there was no worries there. And so when it came to the exclusion crisis, there was debate in Parliament and also in pamphlet literature, because the Licensing Act had lapsed, which meant that people who were normally restricted from criticizing, the king, religion, and that sort of thing, could actually say what they wanted because they hadn't renewed the act. And so there was even a debate about whether the line of succession could be skipped over James because he was Catholic and replace him on the throne with his eldest daughter, Mary, who had just gone off to the Netherlands with her, having married William of Orange, who would be the future William III, who was not only James's nephew, but also his son-in-law. So, yeah. So, yeah, not so complicated family tree there. And there was also debate as well about whether there was rumors that Charles had actually had a big mismarriage, because there was rumors that he had married before Catherine his first mistress, Lucy Walter, who was the mother of his eldest child, James, Duke of Monmouth. And so there were people who were even saying, well, why don't we have Monmouth replacement as replacing James as heir? And so it gets really, really messy. And so Charles actually swears several times on oath and to his Privy Council and elsewhere that the only legal marriage he ever had was to Catherine. It was not to Lucy Walton. And he makes that case several times, when quite easily, if he wanted to, he could have said, "Oh yeah, it's not real. We completely annul the marriage and end of end of story." And that doesn't happen at all. He always swore that Catherine was his only legal wife. And so people just got frustrated, that they were given all these Protestant options and he was refusing them.
It's awful, and all of it, every single attack, and it's constant for about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah,
it's every single day, constant attacks. They're all, in effect, about Catherine. They're all related to Catherine. Either he shouldn't have married her in the first place, he shouldn't be married to her now, he should get rid of her. She hasn't done her job. All of these things all comes down to her. How did she react to all of this pressure, all these accusations made? I mean, the ridiculous ones about, you're trying to poison your husband is just insane. But how did she react to all of this and to the threat to her position? What does she do? I'm guessing she sits quietly and says nothing.
Well, probably outwardly in public she did, but she wasn't going down quietly, put it that way. She was definitely made of much stronger stuff that people that than she's ever been given credit for, really. Because the first thing she does is that, she obviously pleads her case before her husband that I have not plotted to kill you. And not only does he say believe her, because she definitely wasn't plotting to kill him, but when people kept saying, oh, Catherine's trying to kill you, he was like, no, I mean, it's the way he says it's not particularly kind, because he says, she's not capable, she hasn't got it actually in her to try and kill me if she wanted to. She's a bit of a feeble woman, but she has no heart, horrible bone in her body. But when it came to people say, oh, so Emma Berry Godfrey was killed at Somerset House at this particular time, he just went, no, she didn't. I was there. I was with her at the time in Somerset House. She definitely did not kill, have Jesuits murdering Sir Emma Berry Godfrey, because I would have known about it. I was there. But yeah, what she does is that she does several things. So the one thing that she has to try and deal with is the fact that her Catholic, her household, and she has a mixture of Catholic and Protestant servants. Those who, loyally served her for years. Was that she tried to protect her household. So there's a lot of attention on her household and people to try and expel them from court. Unless you're definitely needed, no Catholics beyond 10 miles of a certain perimeter in London, including of her household. And so she starts inquiring what exactly do her articles of marriage in that Anglo-Portuguese treaty say that she's allowed to have. So she's already making inquiries. What is the definite number of Catholic servants I'm legally allowed to have? And people are drawing up who are Catholic in her household to work out whether they should be expelled or not. Some Catholic servants do go. Her physician is arrested, accused of the poisoning angle, but he was actually acquitted in April. So people actually were like, yeah, no, he definitely wasn't going to kill the king. There were Jesuits who were hung and executed, hung, drawn, and quartered for their alleged involvement in the plot. But one thing she also does is that she writes to her brother, who is the King of Portugal, explaining the situation. And obviously her brother, King Pedro II, was not particularly happy that his sister, again, Infanta of Portugal, but also the Queen of England, being accused of plotting to kill her husband. And so there's a lot of international diplomatic situations going on, because he sends an ambassador over to work out what on earth is going on. And so the English are like trying to downplay it, because I think obviously they're quite happy to maybe accuse the Queen of doing it, but they don't expect Portugal to come over to go, what are you doing? And so they don't try and downplay it. They try to try and sort the situation, that's saying, it's just a few of my parliamentarians, I'll try and dissolve parliament, I'll try and sort the situation out. And so it becomes a bit of a mess. And it just shows that she actually had a lot of cards to play that she decided to utilize on this particular moment.
Amazing. I just think that's
so she wasn't afraid to she wasn't afraid to actually assert her authority when needed.
I think she was a lot tougher, and this shows that she's a lot tougher than anyone gives her credit for, to actually sit down and say, right, I need to know what my rights are, and to sit and go through that document and find out exactly where she stands, and to tell her brother, because he's her strongest ally, internationally. I think she kind of kicked a bit of ass at this point.
Oh, she totally did. Yeah, she was like, right, I've had enough of this. And the thing is, I think again, the problem that lots of biographies have, when they do talk about Catherine Braganza, because there's not that many that have been written solely about her, and when they do, they normally focus on, she brought tea over, didn't have children, didn't do much. That's really the line that has been flogged for decades and decades and decades.
Yeah.
But she was actually, even though she didn't have any children, she still actually wielded a lot of power. She had a lot of people wanting to visit her, wanting to kiss her hand. Privy Purse accounts always, she's getting gifts from people all the time. And the when she becomes queen, the Irish are already sending over people say try and get some liberty of conscience of Catholics in Ireland as her new subjects. And she was apparently, even though, again, dispelling the whole myth, she wasn't popular at court because apparently she dressed dressed weirdly and wasn't as pretty. I mean, there's one account where I read this book or biography written about Catherine from like the 1960s. It was either the 1930s or 1960s, where apparently she looked like a frog because of her olive coloured skin making her look green, which I think is just absolutely horrible description.
That just feels a little bit racist. That's horrible.
Yeah. I mean, it's a sign of the times when the book was written. I can't remember which author that was now who wrote that, but I was very annoyed at that. I think it may be Carola Oman that wrote that one on a biography of Mary of Modena, but obviously Catherine comes up a lot in that.
Of course.
But Catherine was quite popular. I mean, the one thing that is talked about, and I think John Miller talks about in his book on Popery and Politics, and also John Kenyon in his book on the Popish plot for which is about 50 years old now, they all talk about the fact that Catherine was actually popular at court. So she may have not been as flaunting flaunting it as the mistresses who were unpopular because, they're literally bleeding the money the king's expenditure dry every year. But
Yeah.
the Queen was, seemed to be quite a genuinely kind person, and that and that's someone that people wanted to get the patronage from, that people wanted to be seen in her courtly circles with. So again, dispelling the rumors and the myths about her.
Amazing. I'm also thinking about sort of all the illegitimate children as well. So every time the king has an illegitimate child, there's a lot of expenditure that goes on that kid. And it's the frustration with the mistresses and their seemingly limitless ability to procreate.
And bleed the coffers dry. Yeah, because every time a new child had come, they had to have their own household, and then it was like, oh, I need to actually maybe start marrying them off to, because even though they're illegitimate, they need good families because they have royal blood in them.
Oh
It's
yeah.
like dowries. Oh no, when it's the female children.
And it's like if you're looking for these bloodlines now, just look at the royal family and everywhere around, they're everywhere. Um, so we mentioned Catherine becoming a rallying point for Catholics at court. But she's less than generous when it comes to relations with the Duchess of York. So tell us how Catherine reacted when she's asked to stand up for Mary of Modena Catholic rights.
Yeah, see, this is interesting. And again, it almost brings back to the question we had about Henrietta Maria, that we assumed that, they would get on well. And Henrietta Maria and Catherine, to be fair, I think did relatively get on as well as can be, bear in mind, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationships. People assume that Catherine and Mary would naturally get on because, they're both foreign Catholic princesses, both coming over to marry, the Stuarts, one being the king, one potentially being the future king, that they would get on quite happily, together. Oh no, it was not the case. Mary and Catherine did not get on well at the beginning, because when Mary comes over, she's 15 to marry James. Catherine is in her mid-30s at this point, so if anything, it might not only be the fact, there's this new, young, potentially fertile person coming over to producing children. If you think about it, when you're in your 30s, you've got this 15-year-old, you probably like, it's the generation gap. And also she's probably thought, Mary would not have matured as much in that regard. And Mary was meant to have her own chapel to worship in, when she came over to England. And because Catherine of Braganza had set up in Somerset House after Henrietta Maria died in 1669 in France, Somerset House was then gifted to Catherine as her main residence. They said, well, you don't, because she had been at St. James's Palace before them. They said, well, if you're not using St. James's really anymore, and there's a chapel there which you used to worship in until you moved your household to Somerset House, why don't you give it to Mary? And Catherine just went, nope, it's mine. She was not giving that chapel up at all, because as far as she was concerned, that was still hers. If she wanted to go to St. James's Palace, that had to be her chapel when she was there. And so Mary had to worship in like a little tiny private area somewhere in Whitehall, pretty much in almost like a cloister type situation. And so that probably did not go down well to begin with. But obviously, Catherine being queen, she wasn't, her word meant, overruled the Duchess of York as such. But when the Popish plot happened, with all the problems happening with Catherine's household and Catholics being expelled, it also implied to any other royal court. So it applied to anyone in Charles's court, in James's court, but also in Mary's court. And so Mary and James had both beseeched Catherine because they were having to get rid of some of their servants, that could she just absorb them into her household for protection, because they thought being queen should be able to have more. And she refused to do that because, she was already struggling enough to protect her, from the way I see it anyway. She was already struggling to protect her own Catholic householders and officers and servants. She couldn't also try and protect theirs, which obviously did not go down very well with Mary and James. But I'm seeing it in a way, I mean, probably by maybe slight bias, because I look at Catherine, but I can sort of see where she's coming from, because she's already struggling. She's already, all the eyes and attention are already on her. I mean, Mary and James already have that issue as well, because I talk about it briefly in the article, but it deserves a separate article in itself. that when investigations for the Popish plot were taking place and Somerset House was being investigated, um, Mary and James's secretary, Edward Coleman's papers were looked into, and it turned out, and again sort of fed into, oh, there is actually a Popish plot, was that there was letters between Coleman and several of Louis the French Catholic King Louis XIV's officials and priests to that basically offering bribes so that to give to certain politicians in Parliament to sort of dissolve Parliament and then have a pro-French faction in the pocket as such. And so when those letters were revealed, it was like, oh, there might actually genuinely be a Popish plot. And so that's why Mary and James had a lot of heat as well, and why they again tried to get Catherine to take on the servants. So it didn't. So yeah. So back then it didn't go down very well. But I think things improved from over the years. And after Charles had died and James became king, and obviously Mary became queen, I think relationships did get better. And Catherine was actually one of the witnesses to the birth of James Francis Edward Stuart by Mary. And she visited Mary when Mary was in exile in the 1690s when she finally returned to Portugal. So I think relationships had warmed by then. But yeah, back in the 1670s, they were not particularly great, so I would say.
Oh, and Coleman, I mean, he, being caught, unfortunately, red-handed with these papers was almost a gift, wasn't it, to Charles? Because there kind of are some papers linking us to France and Catholicism, but they won't be found for another 100 or so years.
Yeah, because obviously Coleman lost his life because of those ones, because it was like he's committed treason because he's conspiring with the French,
Yeah.
as were other people, just the others didn't get caught. But the secret treaty of Dover, which you're alluding to, which obviously Coleman was aware about and sort of people suspected was about, ironically, Catherine's, because there were about 5 Catholics had signed the secret treaty of Dover along with Charles, where Charles promised he would convert to Catholicism if Louis would then send an army over to quash any potential uprisings that may occur when this happens. But he was getting money from Louis in the meantime for this. So obviously, Charles was poor. He needed to pay off his mistresses.
Yeah,
and
got a lot of mistresses.
Yeah. But what's really interesting, of the 5 Catholics that were there who signed it were members of Catherine's household, and Catherine was there when was in Dover when the secret treaty of Dover was signed, because obviously there was the public treaty and then the secret one, and so her household were actually involved in that, and so Catherine would have known the details of this, that her husband potentially was going to convert to Catholicism one day, which obviously he did right at the very end. But there was always that hope. But yeah, so it probably was just as well that no one actually discovered that particular one, because I think that probably would have completely altered the situation for her, perhaps, if the public did know and if politicians genuinely did know about the secret treaty and that her courtiers were involved in it.
My goodness. Well, listeners, are you still thinking about Catherine as being a sort of quiet little mousy type? She's got her fingers in everything. It's amazing. So Eilish, look, I've got to ask you before we start wrapping up. I need to ask you the $64 million question. Why do you think Charles stayed married to Catherine?
It's a good question. I think that's the one question people always do ask. And that's the one thing that is always quite strong in any biographies of Charles II or on Catherine, is why did they stay together? Why didn't Charles go? Especially, with there was this famous divorce case in 1670 between Lord Roos, where he divorced his wife who had an affair and had set up with another man, as he got to divorce her. And Charles, because it was a noble, it had to be debated in the House of Lords, and Charles actually attended the entire debate. And so people thought that maybe he was trying to get tips on how to divorce Catherine. and again, he was like, no, that's not happening. But it's a tricky one, because again, I don't think he loved her the same way as he did his mistresses, but he did have genuine affection for her. And I think that kind of happened anyway when she nearly died in 1663, when she was so ill and so delirious that and he was at her bedside, I should add, the entire time in between visiting Barbara Villiers in the evenings for supper. He always stayed at her bedside for over a month, pretty
Yeah.
much, because she was that ill and people thought she was generally going to die. And she was convinced in her delirium at one point that she had given birth to three children by him, and she was upset because she thought one of the babies in her delirium that was ugly, and he reassured her, oh no, it's a handsome baby. And I think that changed things for him, because I think he saw how genuinely not only did she love him, but also how desperately she wanted to have children to give him. And he did always defend her honor when needed to, because Barbara Villiers snubbed her one time within earshot of the king, and he literally told her to get out of the room. And yeah, so bear in mind she was then the prime mistress. He was like, you are not talking to the queen like that. And I think they genuinely did have affection for each other. They still did things together. And obviously during the Popish plot, she moved back temporarily to Whitehall until the heat died down. But she was there at his bedside when he was dying, and he begged her forgiveness for how he had been to her. And when she had to leave temporarily because she had cried so much, she had to be taken out of the room because she was exhausted, and she begged his forgiveness. He was pretty much, he does, why is she asking me for forgiveness? It should be I having forgiveness. And so they seem to have almost like a sort of I'm trying to think of the word, a loving relationship, but it wasn't a sexual relationship. It was more like it was much more platonic, that's the word, a much more platonic relationship.
Yeah. He ended up sort of having those relationships almost with quite a lot of the former mistresses, the ones that it wasn't the relationship wasn't sort of as fiery and as passionate as it had been, but he kind of kept them around and sort of seemed to genuinely like the company of women.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he was a very compared to his dad, he was definitely much more a people person in more ways than one.
Which it's always very hard to talk about that with Charles II without then having the kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Yeah, he was fond of women's company. Yeah, yeah, well, he was a people person. Yeah, yeah, because he did re-people a lot of the country. Catherine, I mean, the problem is with her, I sort of still sort of gravitate towards saying poor Catherine because, but she's not. She's got agency and she needs more looking at. She's been overlooked, she's been ignored, she's been forgotten, and definitely misunderstood. So if you had 30 seconds to reintroduce Catherine to the world, what would you say?
I would say that Catherine is a queen that we shouldn't underestimate at all. She is a woman that not only survived different hardships in terms of her physical life, but also one that she had to deal with politically as well. But also a figure that who was highly sought after for her patronage, her devotion, but also for the fact that she was a genuinely good person that people wanted to be around. And that even after when Charles died, was someone that they still wanted to go to for patronage and also to go and listen to some Catholic sermons in her chapel.
I think she sounds amazing, and I hope that we get many more things to read about her from you in the future, Eilish. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me again.